Good evening, friends. We're so glad to be able to be with you tonight and finally have a live stream for you because we've been hindered quite a bit here lately. And wanted to offer a little bit of an explanation before we get into the study tonight. First, before that, though, we want to thank you for joining us and welcome you to the study. I'm joined by Brother Miguel Garcia tonight, and Miguel and I are just simply delighted to come to you because we've really been hindered so much lately. As we think about the hindrances lately, we've had snow in our area. So we had a snowstorm one midweek with quite a bit of snow where we couldn't travel and get to the place of live stream. So that hindered us. And then following week, there was an ice storm in the area, and that kept us also off the roads. And so we've had those hindrances. And then I got sick for a couple of weeks and didn't have the voice to speak, and lots of sinus problems and such things. And then a couple of times here lately also we have not been able to launch. We have been able to get our live stream up on YouTube, but we have not been able to get it up on Facebook. And hopefully all of that now has been repaired, and we're good to go, and we hope it stays that way tonight. If you should lose us tonight for some reason, just be patient and stay with us. We believe we know how to fix it rather quickly. And if so, Brother Miguel will get that done, and we'll be back up and teaching again very quickly, and I'll give you a summary of something you might have missed. With those things said, let me, since it's been spaced so far between some of our live streams, let me just summarize the things that we've covered thus far. We are studying the book of Daniel. It's going to be a fascinating study. There are parts of it now, bear in mind, that are a little bit more dry than others. Some of the visions and some of the highly symbolic areas of the book are very exciting. And we're going to be very enthusiastic in those parts. It's going to be really enjoyable, and you're going to learn a lot of things. Bear in mind, however, that there are some things in the book that are just informational, and they're not going to be as exciting to you. And one of those is tonight. It may have somewhat of a little dry appearance to it. Although the things that are in it are very important, it's just not going to be as exciting as visions of beasts and he-goats and rams and such things as that as we're going to encounter in the book. So bear that in mind as we study from week to week, that we'll be getting to a lot of really good things for you. And if you'll stay with this study, I think that there'll really be a lot of benefit out of it that will come your way. So give us that opportunity to teach the book, and we're going to be very methodic in doing so. Take our time, and this will cover, of course, several weeks and months of study. And we left off by giving you a summary of what I did the times that we have studied. In part one, I read to you the book of Daniel. And we read all 12 chapters. And I summarized those chapters a little bit with you and tried to give you an idea of what's going to be in each one of them, what lies ahead of us, what you can expect from the study. I hope that would not only allow you to hear the book read and to say that you've been able to read it, but also to know some of the exciting things that are going to be appearing in the book as we study. So that was the first study. The second study, that I talked to you a lot about the inspiration of the book, because there's a lot of people who believe that Daniel was not a prophet, that Daniel was not inspired, that the Daniel that purports to have written these things did not live back in the time when he says he did, but that somebody later on, after these historical events occurred, wrote them down. And I suppose the reasoning is that the book is so accurate historically that there are many people who are agnostics or atheists or doubters, scoffers, who just refuse to believe that God would know the future like this and would be able to reveal it to a man like Daniel, who is called by the Lord Jesus Christ a prophet. But I showed you many proofs that the book indeed is inspired, that Daniel indeed was a prophet, and we talked about that in part two some. And then I also in part two talked to you about the approach that we need to make to the book of Daniel, and I pointed out that it's a lot like the book of Revelation. You know, Revelation is full of pictures and visions, highly symbolic pictures, much symbolism in the book. And Daniel is that way. And when you study, the general rule of study is simply this, and most of you know these rules of study. When you study the Bible, the rule is that you take everything literally that you read. You do that unless doing so involves you in a contradiction of other scriptures or involves you in an absurdity of some kind that just simply will not fit. It's too absurd. And so then you have to understand that God not only spoke literally at times, but God spoke figuratively. God used parables. God used symbols. And God used visions and dreams and all kinds of things to reveal His will. The book of Hebrews opens up by saying in chapter 1 and verse 1, God who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets. So God spoke different ways back there to the fathers by the prophets. He didn't just speak literally. He used symbolism. And so we've got to understand how God speaks. And the general rule is we take God literally in His Word, unless doing so involves us in contradictions or in absurdities. And then, of course, we have to take it spiritually or symbolically. That was the second study, the inspiration of the book and the approach that we've got to make to the book. And we're going to approach Daniel in some places like we do Revelation. We're going to say, all right, this is the vision that Daniel saw. This is literally what he saw. Now, what does it mean? Because when we get to chapter 7, we're going to say, all right, Daniel saw 4 beasts come up out of the sea. That's what he literally saw. Now, what do they mean? In chapter 8, Daniel saw a 2-horned ram that was coming from the east and that was pushing north, south, and westward and conquering everything in its path. And he saw a he-goat come out of the west with a notable horn between his eyes. This is what Daniel saw. Now the question becomes to us, what does it mean? And so that's going to be our approach to Daniel in a lot of places, and I want you to keep that in mind. Here's what he saw, here's the vision, this is literally what he saw, and he wrote what he literally saw, but what does it mean? And that's where we look for the symbolism. That's where we cannot take it literally, because Daniel's, while he's seeing a literal ram and a goat, that's not what the symbols stand for. And when we studied 8 and I gave you a little synopsis, I showed you that the ram was really Medo-Persia. It was that empire. And that the ram was the kingdom of Greece. That the horn between the eyes there was the first king of Greece, which was Alexander the Great. And so you see the symbolism. The goat was Greece. It was a goat, all right, but that was not the meaning of the vision. The goat represented Greece. Anyway, when we approach the book, those are some things that I want you to keep in mind. Then in the third part of the study, I talked to you about a historical survey of the history of Israel. And I took us back to Moses and the children of Israel being led out of Egypt into Mount Sinai, and gave a little synopsis of the history of the nation of Israel. And I talked to you a little bit about the division of the 12 tribes, how 10 tribes split away from 2, or from the other 2, and where there were 12 tribes, there became a separate northern kingdom in Israel called Israel that was composed of 10 of the tribes that pulled off. And I showed you that 2 of the tribes remained loyal to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, and they formed a southern kingdom called Judah. I showed you that in 721 BC, the Assyrians, not Syria, but Assyria, the Assyrians came and conquered these 10 tribes in the north, taking a lot of them captive and scattering them throughout some of the other lands that they had conquered. Then along came Babylon and conquered Assyria. In the meanwhile, the 2 tribes, Judah, that formed the nation of Judah, the southern kingdom, they continued on a little bit further in their history until finally in 606 BC, Babylon conquered them. And so we gave a lot of this history, how that Daniel was a captive over in Babylon, and I'll take you briefly through that tonight as we recap the first chapter. So I did that historical survey with you in part 3, and then we began a study of chapter 1, and we didn't get a long way into chapter 1, not very many verses at all, but I tried to give you a little bit of the history behind the captivity that Daniel experienced. I took you back to Deuteronomy chapter 28. When you read Deuteronomy 28, Moses predicted captivities like this, that if the children of Israel broke covenant with him and disobeyed him and served other gods and not him, then he would allow enemies to come in and conquer them. And of course, that was predicted by Moses in Deuteronomy 28:15. We read verses 36, 37 in Deuteronomy 28, and also verses 49 through 52. And then I showed you that others made predictions of this, not just Moses, but Isaiah spoke about it in Isaiah chapter 39, and we read that prophecy. Isaiah predicted the captivity in Babylon. And then you'll find Isaiah predicting it again over in 2 Kings chapter 20 and verses 1 through 7 and following. Finally, Jeremiah predicted it in Jeremiah 25 verses 1 to 12, and I read that with you. And Jeremiah even predicted the duration. Jeremiah says that they will be in captivity for 70 years. And Jeremiah warned the Jews. He tried to tell them, you're going to be conquered. When you're conquered, serve the king of Babylon. Just be at peace. Just build your houses, take wives, bear children, be fruitful so that your nation will not perish. And plant your vineyards over there and just raise your families. And just bide your time there, because in 70 years, all of you that are captive will be coming out of there, and you'll be restored back. Your children and others that even were small when you were taken or else was born over in Babylon, they'll be coming back to the land of your forefathers. Just serve Babylon. But you know, Israel wouldn't do that. There are people in Israel, their leaders, for example, that provoked the attack by Babylon. Manasseh was one of them. He was a wicked king. So I read to you 2 Kings chapter 24 verses 1 to 4. And I read 2 Kings 21 verses 1 to 16 and showed you how Manasseh was so evil that he brought a lot of this, of course, this destruction, this ruin upon his own nation. So the Lord then brought judgment against the Jews. And that's what the Babylonian captivity is all about. God's people had turned from him, broken his covenant, served other gods, committed abominable things in his sight, to the point that God could no longer tolerate it. And so finally, the only just thing that God could do was to bring a judgment against his people, to straighten them out, to punish them, and to bring them back by way of correction to the ways that they ought to be going. And the Lord used Babylon to do that. You know, God uses nations to punish other peoples. He just does. And he'll even use them to punish his own people. He will try his people by the brutality of other nations. And this was perpetuated by the Lord then through, by the means of Babylon, and it was done in 3 stages, if you'll remember. I told you there were 3 different sieges that took place against Jerusalem, the first being in 606 BC. I read to you from 2 Chronicles 36, verse 5 through 8, where this was documented and predicted and such things, and of course recorded. And then in 598 BC, Babylon came again. And that's in 2 Chronicles 36, verse 9 and 10, and we read those verses. I showed you what happened. And then finally, since the Jews just kept provoking Babylon, they came again in 587 BC. And in 587, they leveled the walls of Jerusalem. They They destroyed the temple that Solomon had built. And we read some of that in 2 Chronicles 36, verse 11 and 12. They desecrated the house of God. And we talked about that some. They took the vessels that were in the temple that Solomon had built, gold and silver and brass and such things, very precious and valuable things. The treasures that were found therein, all of the money that the Jews had stored back, because many of these ancient temples, you see, were used for banks. We may have Fort Knox here in America, but they had temples, and a lot of the ancient countries, the ancient world, used the magnificent temples they had to store their wealth and their treasures in. It was well guarded there. And of course, when they were conquered, those that took control of them then went into their temples and they plundered them and they desecrated them and took away all the valuable treasures that they had. And that's what Babylon did to the Jews. And so they carried those sacred vessels that were in the temple over to Babylon, and they put them in the temple of their God over there. And they kept them there, and that'll come into play later on in the book of Daniel in chapter 5, as we'll see Belshazzar have a drunken feast using the vessels to drink wine out of from the temple of God there in Jerusalem that were conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, his father. And now that pretty much takes us to where we left off in our study. I showed you the temple was destroyed, and you see Daniel's among the captives. He was among the first siege in 606 BC. Daniel was carried off, very likely as a teenager. And then in the second stage of the siege in 598, Ezekiel was carried over to Babylon, and he and about 10,000 others. And of course, there were others carried away in the 587 siege, but many people were killed. And let's talk now about the fate of these royal captives, and let me move to Daniel chapter 1 now, verse 3 through 7, and let you read with me here on the screen. The Bible says, "And the king spake unto Ashpenaz," this is Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, "unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. So here we have then these Hebrew captives, and notice now that Daniel is very likely of the king's seed back there in Judah, of the royal house. He is out of the tribe, in fact, of Judah. And he and the others, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they're also out of that same kind of lineage. And you know, it's just a fact that, of course, Daniel's a righteous man. It's a fact that you and I need to be aware of, that the righteous suffer right along with the guilty. Now, friends, this has always been true. And sometimes we wonder, well, why do righteous people suffer? You know, the wicked don't discriminate when they come against something or when they attack. When Babylon came and laid siege against Jerusalem, they didn't ask who was righteous. They just killed. They just took captive. They just massacred. They just destroyed. They didn't have any interest in determining who were God's children and who weren't, who was faithful and who wasn't. The enemies of God don't make those kind of determinations. When they come to kill, they bring the sword and they kill the righteous right along with the right along with the wicked. But you know, the righteous have always suffered along with the guilty. They've always done that. If you'll think about the children of Israel, when they wandered in the barren wilderness for 40 years because 12 men that were sent in as spies had come back, 10 of them with a false report. And God, for every day they were gone, caused them to wander a year in the wilderness. They were gone 40 days, they wandered 40 years. Friends, there were children among those Israelites. They didn't murmur, not like the adults. They weren't guilty of things that the adults did. And yet they had to wander right along with the adults. They were innocent, but they suffered with the guilty. In the book of Revelation, you'll see that when the beast, which is Rome there in that book, when the beast came against the church and killed many Christians, of course, the innocent suffered. Rome attacked and conquered a lot of people, but it also attacked people that were completely righteous and completely innocent. And so those Christians had to suffer there greatly in the first century and following. But then we see it in our day and age. Friends, when a man commits a crime and he is sentenced and he has to go to prison, and let's say he's got a family, let's say he's got little children. What's those little children done wrong? They've done nothing. What's his wife done? Perhaps nothing. And yet that family's going to suffer now because the breadwinner of that family's in jail. He's in prison. And so they suffer financially and economically. They don't have the living that they need sometimes. They are deprived of necessities of life. And life is very difficult for that wife that's left behind. She has no husband now with her in the home. She has no companion. She has no love, no lover. She has none of that with her, and she has no father for her children. And now her children are growing up without dad in the home, and she's there in the home without a husband. It just works a hardship. And that wife and children have done nothing, and yet they suffer because of the guilty. That's always true. And so Daniel, Ezekiel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego find themselves over in Babylon. They've done nothing wrong. They serve God faithfully. What's the problem? The innocent suffer along with the guilty. Because you see, Babylon did not discriminate. They just took captives. They didn't ask if a man was righteous or wicked. When they used the sword, when they came against Jerusalem, they didn't ask who's righteous, who's wicked. They just slew people. And so many times righteous people die in some of these sieges and battles because there's no way to discriminate by an enemy like that. So in Exodus 20, you see that principle taught when Moses gave the law to Israel. He warns them about idolatry and these other gods. He said, "Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For the Lord thy God is a jealous God, visiting iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments." So God says that he will visit the iniquity of the father upon the children to the third and fourth generation. Now, they won't be responsible for the father's sin, but they'll suffer because of it. The punishment due to the father many times carries right on down through the family for several generations. And that's what Moses is warning them as he writes God's word here to them in the Ten Commandments. Now these men who are righteous are over in a foreign country. They're captives, they're slaves, and they're turned over now to a guy named Ashpenaz, who is the master of the eunuchs. We read about him. I'll talk to you about eunuchs here in just a moment. But in Daniel 1, verse 3, the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes. Verse 7, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. So we read about this master of the eunuchs. Now, Jesus talks some about eunuchs. A eunuch is simply someone who does not or cannot or will not have relations with a woman. And kings in their courts and palaces and all kept eunuchs. I suppose in some ways it made their harem of women safer because their servants would not be involved in going after their women and trying to have relations with them. And so they kept these men as eunuchs. But in Matthew 19, when Jesus taught on marriage and divorce, his disciples think that his sayings are rather hard on that. And so in verse 10 to 12 of Matthew 19, his disciples say unto him, if the case of the man be so with his wife, it is not good to marry. But he said unto them, all men cannot receive this saying, save to whom it is given. For there are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb. And there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men. And there are some eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. So the Lord talked about eunuchs, this idea of a man who cannot have sexual relations with a woman. He said some of them are born that way, and indeed there are people born that way. He said some of them have been made that way by men, and they've been castrated. He said others still have made themselves eunuchs, and that's men like Paul and others who lived a single life all their life and never took a wife or never saw the necessity of it, were able to control themselves in such a fashion they didn't need to. And so there are different ways to become a eunuch. And now these men are turned over to this fellow. They are looking for, of course, a certain type of individual that I want to talk about. But, sometimes men look at things for the wrong reason. They choose someone for the wrong reason. There are a lot of times a young man will take a wife. He will want a woman that's just as beautiful as she could be. He wants an absolute beauty queen. Some men do. And some women, when they get ready to marry a fella, they don't look on the inside of him. They pick some handsome fella there on campus, some very popular boy, the captain of the football team or some sports star, either in basketball, football, or some other sport. And they choose him for that reason. They don't really look him over through and through to see what's inside. Many times they choose from the outside. And the king was kind of this way. When he got ready to select people that he wanted to surround him, he wanted some that were really handsome looking and well favored and such things. In Daniel 1, verse 4 and 5, this eunuch was charged in finding from among the captives there in Judah, among Daniel and them, children in whom was no blemish, well favored and skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and to whom they might teach the learning in the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. So he's looking for a certain kind of young man. And specifically, he wants one with no blemish, well favored, and such things. Now, there were other things that he insisted upon, but those were part of it. And in Proverbs 31 and 30, the Bible says that favor is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. So then it's not just outward beauty that we need to look at when we consider someone, but we need to consider many, many things. We need to consider their personality, their for example, their morals. We need to consider their character, and their influence, maybe their reputation, their family name. There's many, many things to consider when one is selecting a mate or someone else for a position. Honesty, all kinds of factors that one would look at, dependability, work ethic. There are just many, many, many things. And so beauty is not really the thing that should be singled out and favored over anything else. Obviously, when you're going to marry someone, there has to be a physical attraction. But there has to be more than that, or we're not going to wind up with the right person. Also, the names of these men were changed. Did you notice Daniel's name? Daniel's name in Hebrew meant God judges. Did you know that? God judges. But his name was changed by the folks there in Babylon to the name of Belteshazzar. Now we're going to see him called Belteshazzar a little bit later in the book. Belteshazzar, and that means Baal protects. Baal protects. He's named after one of their gods. His name really means God judges, the God of heaven. But they changed him to Belteshazzar after their God. Hananiah's name in Hebrew meant Jehovah is great. But Hananiah's name was changed to Shadrach. Mishael, his name meant in Hebrew like God, but it's changed to Meshach. And then Abednego, or Azariah really he's called, Azariah, his name meant in Hebrew Jehovah helps. It's changed to Abednego. So Daniel, God judges. Hananiah, Jehovah's great. Mishael, like God. Azariah, Jehovah helps. And they're changed now to Belteshazzar for Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Given names over there. All right. Now these men were faithful, and God, of course, protects his faithful children, and he blesses them because they had a lot of courage. And I want to read to you from Daniel 1, at least verses 8 through 16. And let's notice now what Daniel purposed in his heart that he would or would not do. Daniel determined, I'm over here in this land as a captive. He's just a young man, but I'm going to serve God faithfully over here. And he purposed in his heart to do that. Let's read what the text says about Daniel and the others. In Daniel 1, now I'll read 8 through 21, and we'll come back and talk a little bit about 8 through 16. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank thereof. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse lacking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall you make me endanger my head to the king. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat. And as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he consented to them in this matter, and proved them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning, and at the end of, learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now, at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Therefore stood they before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And Daniel continued even to the first year of King Cyrus. So now God blesses these men. Let's look at these verses that we've read here just a minute. You see the faithful courage of these 4 young men. The king commands to feed them with a certain portion of his food. So the king allotted food every day to these captives. He was going to feed them 3 years, nourish them with his food, with his wine. I mean, this was top-notch food to the Babylonians. They got the best. He wanted them well nourished. And of course, then after the end of 3 years, they would be brought in before the king. But you see, in order to eat the king's portion of meat, Daniel and the others would have to violate the law of Moses. Because a lot of times the animals that Gentiles like these Babylonians ate, they were unclean to the Israelite. He could not eat them. The law of Moses forbid that. And you'll find that in Leviticus chapter 11, and I'm going to read that chapter with you. It's a very interesting chapter. But you see, there were certain things that a Jew just couldn't eat. A Jew, for example, could not eat pork. He could not eat catfish and such things. I'll show you the law on this. And a lot of this meat then that would be fed to Daniel and them was just an unclean type animal that God forbid them to eat according to the law of Moses. And Daniel and the others determined, we will not defile our bodies with this meat that God has forbidden. We won't eat these kinds of animals. Furthermore, a lot of these animals, you have to remember, folks, were sacrificed to idols. And they were not going to eat meat that had been offered to the idol gods in Babylon. They just were not going to do that. And so they wanted to keep themselves from that as well. Let's read Leviticus chapter 1 and verse 1 through 47. I'm going to read this chapter to you. These are the dietary laws that are found in the law of Moses. Now, if you want to read these for yourselves sometime, write these verses down. Leviticus chapter 11, verses 1 through 47. And it will tell you what meats and what fish and other such things, what fowls and birds that the Israelites could eat and couldn't eat. In Leviticus 11 at verse 1, the Lord spake unto Moses and to Aaron, saying unto them, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, These are the beasts which ye shall eat among all the beasts that are on the earth. Whatsoever parteth the hoof, and is cloven-footed, and cheweth the cud among the beasts, that shall ye eat. Nevertheless, these shall ye not eat of them that chew the cud, or of them that divide the hoof, as the camel, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean to you. In other words, friends, an animal, if the Jew was going to eat it, had to part a hoof. It had to have a forked hoof, and then it also had to chew a cud. It had to do both. It couldn't just part the hoof and not chew a cud. It had to do both. It couldn't just chew a cud and not have a parted hoof. It had to have both. And so that's what he's telling them here. Nevertheless, these shall ye not eat of them that chew the cud, or of them that divide the hoof, as the camel, because he cheweth the cud, but he divideth not the hoof. He's unclean to you. And the coney, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean to you. And the hare, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean to you. So no rabbit, you see. And the swine, the pig, though he divide the hoof and be cloven-footed, yet he cheweth not the cud, he is unclean to you. Of their flesh shall you not eat, and their carcass shall you not touch, they are unclean to you. These shall you not eat, or these shall you eat of all that are in the waters. Whatsoever hath fins and scales in the waters, in the seas and in the rivers, them shall you eat. So in order to eat anything out of the water, whether it's river, ocean, whatever, the creature in the sea has to have fins and scales, both. both fins and scales. Well, what does a catfish have? Well, a catfish has fins, has no scales. It would have been unclean. So he's telling them here now, he's named the animals. It has to part a hoof, chew a cud. Now he gets to the waters. These shall you eat of all that are in the waters. Whatsoever hath fins and scales in the waters, in the seas and in the rivers, them shall you eat. And all that have not fins and scales in the seas and in the rivers, of all that move in the waters, and of any living thing which is in the waters, they shall be an abomination unto you. They shall be even an abomination unto you. Ye shall not eat of their flesh, but ye shall have their carcasses in abomination. Whatsoever hath no fins nor scales in the waters, that shall be an abomination unto you. And these are they which ye shall have in abomination among the fowls. Now he gets to birds. He's talked about animals. He's talked about what's in the water. Now the birds. These shall be an abomination among the fowls. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. Here they are. The eagle and the ossifrage and the osprey and the vulture and the kite after his kind, every raven after his kind, and the owl and the night hawk and the cuckow and the hawk after his kind, and the little owl and the cormorant and the great owl, and the swan and the pelican and the gyre eagle, and the stork and the heron after her kind, and the lapwing and the bat. All fowls that creep going upon all four shall be an abomination unto you. So no fowls going upon all four. He said, yet these may ye eat of every flying, creeping thing that goeth upon all four, which have legs above their feet to leap withal upon the earth. Even these of them ye may eat. Notice, the locust after his kind, and the bald locust after his kind, and the beetle after his kind, and the grasshopper after his kind. But all other flying, creeping things which have 4 feet shall be an abomination unto you. So he's telling them very quickly among the fowls, isn't he? And these shall be unclean. Whosoever toucheth the carcass of them shall be unclean even till the evening. And whosoever beareth aught of the carcass of them shall wash his clothes, and be unclean until the even. The carcasses of every beast which divideth the hoof, and is not cloven-footed, nor cheweth the cud, are unclean unto you. Every one that toucheth them shall be unclean. And whatsoever goeth upon his paws among the manner of the beast that go on all 4, these are unclean unto you. Whosoever toucheth their carcass shall be unclean even to the even. And he that beareth the carcass of them shall wash his clothes, and be unclean even to the evening. They are unclean unto you. These also shall be unclean unto you among the creeping things that creep upon the earth, the weasel, and the mouse, and the tortoise after his kind, and the ferret, and the chameleon, and the lizard, and the snail, and the mole. These are unclean to you among all that creep. Whosoever toucheth them, when they be dead, shall be unclean until the even. And upon whatsoever any of them, when they are dead, doth fall, it shall be unclean, whether it be any vessel of wood or raiment or skin or sack, whatever vessel it be, wherein any work is done, it must be put in water, and it shall be unclean unto the evening, so shall it be cleansed. And every earthen vessel whereunto any of them falleth, talking about these unclean things, whatsoever is in it shall be unclean, and ye shall break it. In other words, if you have an unclean animal or bird that falls into a bowl, you just break the bowl. You lose the bowl. He wants it broken. Of all meat which may be eaten, that on which such water cometh shall be unclean, and all drink that may be drunk in every such vessel shall be unclean, and everything whereupon any part of their carcass falleth shall be unclean, whether it be oven or ranges for pots, they shall be broken down. They are unclean. They shall be unclean unto you. Nevertheless, a fountain or pit wherein there is plenty of water shall be clean, but that which toucheth their carcass shall be unclean. And if any part of their carcass fall upon any sowing seed, which is to be sown, it shall be clean. But if any water be put upon the seed, and any part of their carcass fall thereon, it shall be unclean to you. See how meticulous God was? And if any beast of which ye may eat die, he that toucheth the carcass thereof shall be unclean until the even. And he that eateth of the carcass of it shall wash his clothes, and be unclean until even. He also that beareth the carcass of it shall wash his clothes, and be unclean until the even. And every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth shall be an abomination. It shall not be eaten. Whatsoever goeth upon the belly, here's your snake and such things. Whatsoever goeth upon all four, or whatsoever hath more feet among all creeping things that creep upon the earth, them shall ye not eat, for they are an abomination. Ye shall not make yourselves abominable with any creeping thing that creepeth, neither shall you make yourselves unclean with them, that you may be defiled thereby. For I am the Lord your God. Ye therefore shall sanctify yourselves, and ye shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall you defile yourselves with any manner of creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. For I am the Lord that bringeth upon you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. Ye shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. This is the law of the beast, and of the fowl, and of every living creature that moveth in the waters, and of every creature that creepeth upon the earth, to make a difference between the clean and the unclean and the clean, and between the beast that may be eaten and the beast that may not be eaten. Now that's the whole chapter of Leviticus 11. And there's part of what Daniel and the others are concerned about. They've got all these dietary laws. Daniel doesn't want to break those. And so he asked this fellow that's put in charge of he and the others, look, can we just have the things that we want? If you'll just feed us 10 days with pulse, with vegetables, with things we want to eat. And he reluctantly agreed to do it. He would give them 10 days. But at the end of 10 days, their flesh, their skin was much more fair than the flesh of all of those around them that had been eating the king's meat, the king's portion of things. And so he just took away the king's portion from Daniel and the other three and let them eat pulse and fed them with that. And they looked wonderful after 3 years compared to all of the others. So Daniel, you see, is determined here he's going to be faithful to God over here in this strange land. The Bible has a lot to say about eating blood, and a lot of times these animals, for example, that the king might serve these men, the blood wouldn't be drained from it. Friends, listen, God has forbidden man to eat blood. He has forbidden that back in the age of the patriarchs. When Noah got off the ark, one of the first things God told Noah and his sons was don't eat the blood of any flesh. Under the law of Moses in Leviticus 17, they were forbidden to eat blood. You and I over in the New Testament today in Acts chapter 15, we are forbidden to eat blood. Now I'll read to you from Leviticus 17, verse 10 to 16. This is what Daniel was under. And he wasn't going to eat the king's meat because it may not have been drained of blood. It may have been a strangled animal, something like that, and he was not going to eat things like this. Leviticus 17 and verse 10. Whatsoever man there be of the house of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn among you that eateth any manner of blood, I will even set my face against that soul that eateth blood, and I will cut him off from his people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I've given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul. Therefore I said unto the children of Israel, No soul of you shall eat blood, neither shall any stranger that sojourneth among you eat blood. And whatsoever man there be of the children of Israel, of the strangers that sojourn among you, of the children of Israel, the strangers that sojourn among you, which hunteth and catcheth any beast or fowl that may be eaten, he shall even pour out the blood thereof and cover it with dust. So God said, not only drain the blood out of an animal, I want it covered with dust. For it is the life of all flesh, the blood of it is for the life thereof. Therefore I said unto the children of Israel, ye shall eat the blood of no manner of flesh, for the life of all flesh is in the blood thereof. Whosoever eateth it shall be cut off. And every soul that eateth that which dieth of itself, or that which is torn with beast, whether it be one of your own country or a stranger, he shall both wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the even. Then shall he be clean. But if he wash them not, nor bathe his flesh, he shall bear his iniquity. So there's some of the dietary laws that Daniel and them were up against, and you can see they just don't want to violate those. And so they determined that they would not do so. Now, as we follow our outline a little further here, we see the courage and the faithfulness of Daniel and them. They also didn't want some of this meat because many times it had been offered and sacrificed to idols. You see, a lot of times when sacrifices were offered to these idol gods, of course the idol gods couldn't eat the meat and they couldn't drink the drinks that were offered to them. So they literally took that meat and they took that drink, and the people ate it afterward. And of course, if any of this had been offered to any of their idols, Daniel and the others didn't want to eat it. They didn't want to drink it. And they weren't going to drink intoxicating wine either. And they determined that they wouldn't do that. Let's talk about that blood again in the New Testament in Acts 15, verse 20. Paul said, or others there said at the Jerusalem meeting, we write unto them that they abstain from pollutions of idols, from fornication, from things strangled, and from blood. And then verse 29, that you abstain from meats offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and fornication, from which if you keep yourselves, ye shall do well, fare you well. So again, blood is mentioned. I mentioned that some of these sacrifices were offered to the gods and later eaten by people. And that's what Daniel and them probably were afraid of getting also. Deuteronomy 32, verse 36 to 39, God is almost laughing in derision here. In fact, he is at these idol gods. For the Lord shall judge his people and repent himself for his servants when he seeth that their power is gone and there's none shut up or left. And he shall say, where are their gods and their rock in whom they trusted, which did eat the fat of their sacrifices and drank the wine of their drink offerings? Let them rise up and help them and be your protection. See now that I, even I, am he, and there is no God with me. I kill and I make alive, I wound and I heal. Neither is there any that can deliver out of my hand. God's taunting these idols. He said, where are they? When you're in trouble and need protection, where's your idol gods? While you offered them the fat of your sacrifices, you offered them wine drink offerings. Why don't they rise up and help you? In other words, they couldn't eat what you offered to them and they couldn't drink the wine that you offered to them. Where are they? These idols have no power. And so God is simply deriding them. He's ridiculing them, pointing out that he alone has power. But notice that sacrifices were offered to idols, and this is what Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel wanted to avoid. They did not want to eat things and that had been offered to idols, and they didn't want, not only that, they didn't want to drink strong drink. Let's read some verses now in the New Testament, because Paul wrote quite a bit about Christians not eating meat that has been sacrificed to idols. In 1 Corinthians 10:14, Paul said, wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. And then down in verse 18 through 33, He said, Behold, Israel after the flesh. Are not they which eat of the sacrifices partaker of the altar? Now, Paul's pointing out that a Jewish priest, and incidentally, one of the ways that the Jewish priest fed his family, when the sacrifices to God had been offered, the priest kept a portion of that sacrifice for his family. In that sense, he partook of the altar, and he partook of it as if offered to God. In like manner, when you ate something offered to an idol, you partook of the idol of the altar. In other words, you partook in idolatry, just like the other way around when you ate the sacrifices that the Jews offered. You partook of the proper worship of God. Paul said, What shall I say then? That the idol is anything, or that which is offered and sacrificed to idols is anything? But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. And I would not that ye should have fellowship with devils. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. You cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and the table of devils. Some of the Corinthians were going over to idols' temples. They were eating drinks that were offered to idols. And so they were eating at the idol's table. And Paul said, you can't do that and then eat at the Lord's table. You can't take communion. You can't drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. Verse 22, do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? All things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not. Let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth. Whatsoever is sold in the shambles, that eat, asking no question for conscience sake. When you buy something at a market, don't ask where it came from, Paul said. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If any of them that believe not bid you to a feast, and you be disposed to go, whatsoever is set before you eat, asking no question for conscience sake. But if any say unto you, this is offered in sacrifice unto idols, eat not for his sake that showed it, and for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Conscience, I say, not thine own, but of the other. For why is my liberty judged of another man's conscience? For if I by grace be partaker, why am I evil spoken of for that which I give thanks? Whether therefore you eat or drink or whatsoever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give none offense neither to the Jews, nor to the Gentiles, nor to the church of God, even as I please all men in all things, not seeking mine own profit, but the profit of many, that they might be saved. So this again is more of these sacrifices. And I'm reading a lot of scripture, and I don't want you to get lost in the inertia of all this. Think of it this way. They don't want to eat the king's meat because some of the animals are unclean according to Moses' law. They don't want to eat the king's meat because some of that meat will not have the blood drained from it, and they are forbidden to eat blood. They do not want to eat the king's meat and provisions because some of that meat has been offered and sacrificed to idols. They do not want his drink because it may have been offered to idols, plus they do not want intoxicating beverages. In Proverbs 23 and verse 29 to 35, listen to this. Who hath woe? Who hath sorrow? Who hath contentions? Who hath babbling? Who hath wounds without cause? Who hath redness of eyes? They that tarry long at the wine. They that go to seek mixed wine. Look not thou upon the wine when it is red, when it giveth his color in the cup, when it moveth itself aright. At the last it biteth like a serpent, and stingeth like an adder. Thine eyes shall behold strange women, thine heart shall utter perverse things. Yea, thou shalt be as he that lieth down in the midst of the sea, or he that lieth upon the top of a mast. They have stricken me, thou shalt say, and I was not sick. They have beaten me, and I felt it not. When shall I awake? I will seek it yet again. If you've ever seen a drunk person or been drunken yourself, you've you found that things begin to spin. I had a friend of mine one time that then went out drinking, and he told me later on he'd gotten a hold of some moonshine, and he said he slept in his pickup all night because his truck wouldn't quit spinning. He had to lay there and hold on to the steering wheel all night to keep from throwing up, to keep from being sick in his stomach. Wine, of course, makes us do a whole lot of things that otherwise we would not do if we weren't drunken. We say things and do things and all kinds of activities. And so Isaiah 28 in verse 7, they also have erred through wine, through strong drink, are out of the way. The priest and the prophet have erred through strong drink. They are swallowed up of wine. They are out of the way through strong drink. They err in vision. They stumble in judgment. In Daniel 1 and 8, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So he determined he would not do this. He would not partake of these things. And I would imagine Daniel was willing to die at that point rather than give in. If it were forced upon him, he would not eat it. He resisted the temptation to do so in 1 Corinthians 10:13. There's no temptation taken you but such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you're able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape. So Daniel told this master of the eunuchs and his servant in Daniel 1:12-16, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days. Let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat. And as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he consented to them in this matter, and proved them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse. So he starts giving them beans and vegetables and things like this, and feeds them with the food they requested, and they come out a lot better. So they resisted all of that, as of course Joseph did down in Egypt. So they resisted, and they enjoyed favor with their superiors. You know, when Joseph was down in Egypt, he enjoyed great favor with Potiphar and ultimately with Pharaoh when he began to serve him. But we read in Genesis 39, 1-6, when Joseph was taken down into Egypt as a slave, just like Daniel was over to Babylon, the Bible says Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him out of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put in his hand. And it came to pass from the time that he made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. Verse 21, But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him mercy, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Joseph was just favored everywhere, like Daniel was. And that's what Daniel did. He won favor down here as a captive in this land because of his faithfulness. And at the end of days, he had good health and appearance. Daniel 1:5, at the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. You know, the Bible says in 1 Timothy 4, verse 8, listen, bodily exercise profiteth little, but godliness is profitable unto all things, having the promise of the life that now is, and of that which is to come. So, a lot of times the things that are done from the body profit very little, whereas the things that are done for the soul are the things that really profit. As for Daniel and these other 4 men, folks, they just were brought in before the king at the end of the 3 years. And let's read what the Bible says about them. Daniel 1, verse 17 to 19, as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. So God had given them such great gifts, as he does all of us. You know, sometimes we'll hear folks brag about people, and I know there are people with great talent. We all appreciate talent and skill and ability to reason and think, analyze and such things, and teach. And yet no man today, or ever has, had anything that God didn't give him. There's no need to boast by any of us. If you and I have some special gift, it's not our doing. God gave it to us. 1 Corinthians 4:7, Paul said, for who maketh thee to differ from another? And what hast thou that thou didst not receive? Now if thou didst receive it, why dost thou glory, as if thou hadst not received it? Paul said, don't brag, because anything you've got, you received it. It was given by God. And if you start boasting, why are you doing that? As if you had done this all yourself. We'll see in chapter 4 that Nebuchadnezzar gets in trouble doing this. That'll be an interesting study. One final scripture now I want to leave you with, and this will close out chapter 1, and it will end our study tonight. Daniel 1, verse 20 and 21, the last 2 verses of Daniel 1. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them, speaking of Daniel and the others, 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And Daniel continued even into the first year of King Cyrus. And Cyrus was a Persian, and the Persians and the Medes conquered Babylon. Daniel served all through this 70 years, folks, all through it. And notice the king, in all matters of wisdom and understanding wherein he inquired of them, he found them 10 times better. That's a figurative expression. That's simply a way of saying they were just far superior to anybody else in that kingdom, because God had blessed them with all of this ability. So there again, you see the faithfulness of Daniel. And incidentally, I showed you when we talked about the inspiration of the book of Daniel, that Daniel's mentioned 3 times in the book of Ezekiel. And when he's mentioned, he's put in company with Noah and with Job. Noah, Job, Daniel. Friends, there's likely not 3 men like this in the entire Bible. God named them specifically when he wanted to name righteous men. Daniel is put in among that group, even as a young man. And you see his faithfulness here in chapter 1. I'm glad we could look at that, and this just gives us now background on Daniel and prepares us now for what's coming up next. Let me share with you what is next, because next week is a very important study. It's a study on the kingdom. It's Daniel chapter 2. And the kingdom, God's kingdom, is not well understood by a lot of religious people today. There's a lot of confusion. There are people who believe the kingdom has not been established yet. They believe that Jesus is coming back one day and will set up his kingdom on earth. that he will rule for a literal 1,000 years in the city of Jerusalem on the literal throne of David, and that this is coming in the future right after the so-called 7-year Great Tribulation. So there's a lot of confusion about the kingdom. Daniel is given the ability to interpret the dream of Nebuchadnezzar about this kingdom. I want to study that with you next week. It's a study you need. You need to understand it. It's a study that's going to affect your eternal destiny. It's a study you got to have. You've got to understand and know. And I'm almost begging you to join me next week to catch this study about the kingdom. We'll talk about what it is, whether or not it's been established or not. And we will get that information out of a dream that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, dreamed and that Daniel interpreted. Thank you for joining us tonight. Miguel and I are so grateful to be back with you, and I trust that everything went smoothly tonight in our live stream, and we just greatly appreciate you being a part of this study and allowing us this privilege of talking to you from the Word of God. Thank you, friends. We want you to have a wonderful week ahead. We hope the days are very pleasant for you, that God's blessings fill your life abundantly. And as we leave you here tonight, we hope it's a very pleasant evening also for you, that your life is well tonight and things go well with you. May God bless you. And Lord willing, join us again next week for the second chapter of Daniel. God bless you.